Welcome to part two of our strategic analysis for Rodnim. In this particular area, we're going to deal with probably the most important tool for me in any strategic analysis, Porter's Five Forces. What does it do? It talks about attractiveness and profitability of a given industry or market. It's absolutely essential and key. We're looking at buyers, we're looking at suppliers, we're looking at new entrants, substitutes, etc. Let's take a look at the sort of breakdown for this particular video. We're talking about, firstly, PEST, our environmental scanning tool, section 4 of this analysis. We'll move on to the big boy, Five Forces, and then Porter's Diamond. You'll recall we touched on Porter's Diamond within the pre-seen document analysis, and we talked about that word determinants. Now this has come up certainly in the SBL exam several times. It's important to understand what within the competitive advantage of nations, Porter's thesis on this area, what we mean by competitive advantage and indeed comparative competitive advantage. And most importantly, in terms of applying the diamond to this particular pre-seen partnership, what are those determinants? What was in play to drive this particular industry within Holland? Last area for us is generic strategies. This time around, fairly straightforward for me. More of that in a moment. Let's look at the first area, PEST. Now, some factors more important than others. I'm not going to read it to you. I know you can read. And again, we've touched on these. Really, the area of legislation, regulation, certainly the team at this particular company, Rodnim, will be watching for any changes in regulation that are going to affect the business, possibly in the area of health and safety, but it could be staff, their status. We know that they employ temporary staff over and above the full-time employees. Outside of that, certainly on the political side, changing governments is a potential problem, although obviously there are other industries that would be more concerned about that. The other thing to recognize here is, the possibility of political risk. In other words, if they launch into a new market, a la Ansoff's matrix market development, then certainly we're going to be dealing with a different jurisdiction, a different set of rules, a different set of regulations, whether that's tax, employment, etc., etc. Outside of that, certainly legal exposure and risk is relevant in this area, and indeed that links and ties back in to the whole area of broadly laws and regulations. Moving down the page, economic, again, this has been mentioned several times. Events, broadly speaking, we're generalizing, are a luxury. If we have a change in the climate, it's going to be an issue, whether or not that's in terms of inflation, interest rates, etc., etc. The first thing to go is going to be luxuries. The other area here ties into the latter end section of the pre-seen, and that's that falling operating margins, and indeed broadly falling margins. Now, we've talked about the idea that in this type of very competitive market with new players entering on a regular basis, it's very possible, we're guessing, that prices are being driven down. But it may well be that there's an issue with costs, and if we have economic problems or a change in the economic climate, possibly cost base may increase. So we're going to be in a position in that scenario where we're being squeezed from both sides, on the top end, revenue prices, on the bottom end, with our cost base. Linked into that, obviously, rises in inflation, etc., as mentioned. Let's move into the social area. Certainly people are fickle. Corporates are fickle, private individuals are fickle, changing tastes and attitudes, changing interests, whether or not that's, in relation to entertainment, music, the arts, etc. I think coupled with that, social media is mentioned within the pre-seen in terms of their use of it. There's no detail though, but certainly social media changes over time. look at what's popular now and look at what was popular 5, 10 years ago. It's different. In terms of the environmental impact, broadly speaking, this is a low-key area for me when we think about the impact of an event, let's say a music concert, etc., on the environment. That's not to suggest that the examiner couldn't bring it into a requirement, but for me, not a very big priority. The other area, obviously, is attitude towards tech. We saw reference to tech areas, whether it's AI, QR, etc., and certainly we saw virtual events becoming more and more popular in this particular marketplace. So, certainly, from a scanning perspective, this partnership, Rodnim, needs to keep an eye on this area. The next area for us is tech. Again, as mentioned, it's within the pre-scene. We see several areas for the future, tech and innovation. Obviously, they have an app which has worked very, very well. We need to think clearly about security, privacy. That ties nicely into the whole area of cybercrimes, that threat, hacking, etc. Let's get familiar with the types of threats and also how we might recover. AI, QR mentioned, and indeed the impact of regs or regulation on this whole area of technology, although again, I think that's fairly low-key. Let's move on to the next area here. As mentioned, this is maybe the most important tool, Porter's 5 Forces. What does it do? Why do we use it? Well, as mentioned from the outset on this video, Porter's 5 Forces is used to assess the attractiveness and indeed profitability of a given industry or market. So what we're supposed to do is assess the forces, the strength, whether or not that's a high strength, medium, or indeed low. And I've done that for you. You may or may not agree with my analysis, but as mentioned previously, certainly there's many ways to skin a cat, and there's many, many different case study scripts that will pass. For me, broadly speaking, the buyers, now we're talking about privates, but more importantly, the corporates, sort of low to medium strength. And I think there's, sort of arguments on both sides. Let's talk about increasing the force. What increases the strength, let's say, of corporate and indeed private buyers? The competition, so many options. Absolutely. Do we have a more competitive environment than this? Not so sure. In terms of the substitutes, tricky one this, and I pondered over this for a while. Substitutes, let's remember that when we talk about a substitute, as we'll see below, we're talking about something that satisfies the same need, but it is manufactured or delivered in a different way. Now, it may well be that these virtual events are substitutes. I can't think of too many more. Switching costs. Again, let's make sure we use key buzzwords within our scripts if we get a chance to. There's very little cost. Yeah, we're not told about contracting or contracts, but it seems to me everything's geared to tendering. So, clients, whether they're corporate, private, or indeed public sector, aren't committed month on month, year on year to one event management company. So the switching costs are very, very low, and indeed I would have thought there will be some players in the market, clients, that switch as they see fit. In terms of the decreasing the force, certainly this brand is established. The Rodnim brand is well known even within 6 years. Look at the revenues, look at the profitability. Outside of that, they clearly have, these two partners and the management team, a very, very good feel for the tech side. Now I'm talking about ITIS, but obviously the app and indeed the website, although there's limited information on that. So in terms of these buyers, for me, low to medium, this is a very, very solid company, and I would suggest that the corporate players that use this company use them on a regular basis. Next area for us is the suppliers. Now this is a biggie because let's remember that, strictly speaking, employees are suppliers. They're suppliers of labor. And there will be a variety of other suppliers in this particular business and this particular industry. For example, in the area of IT or indeed IS. But over and above that, think about event management, you know, food suppliers, transport suppliers, logistics, etc., etc. So, in terms of those suppliers, I would say broadly, and I'm generalizing here because there are a range, broadly low. What would increase the force? In other words, what would make the suppliers stronger? Well, it's certainly a growing market. More players are entering. There's more options for suppliers, whether or not you're an employee or an IT supplier. Outside of that, certainly there's a need for high quality staffing, there's a need for high quality supplies because of the competitive nature and the nature of this industry. In terms of decreasing the force, what is it that cuts down the suppliers and their power? Well, the market share and indeed the size. Now, when I say size, I use that advisedly, but let's bear in mind that most players in this industry, most EM businesses are small. This is a reasonable sized business, small in comparison to the four big players, but still reasonable with a fair degree of market share. In addition to that, within Ireland, certainly the home country, they've got a very, very good reputation and a great track record. So these suppliers, whoever they are, employees, ITIS, etc., they want to be associated with this company. Yeah, absolutely. Next area for us is new entrants. Now, this is easy because the bottom line is it's simple, broadly, to enter this market. This is high power. In terms of what increases the force, clearly the growth, low barriers to entry, not least the profitability, and obviously the low switching costs for the corporates, private, and indeed public sector. Decreasing the force is certainly the networks that will have been built up, although I do think that the increasing forces outweigh considerably the decreasing forces here. Linked into that, although less important for me, the area of regulation and indeed compliance. So for me, this is the first one so far that's definitely high power. Let's move on to the next area. Now, again, this is tricky enough because, what are the options? What is it that satisfies the same need as some of the services that they offer? A music concert, let's say, a virtual event, perhaps. The bottom line here that this one, for me, low. When we think about what would increase the force, well, I guess people will try and come up with substitutes, but what they'll do, I'm not so sure. The growth of the industry is important. Absolutely the barriers to entry and the switching costs. Decreasing force, networks, and indeed regulations. So similar to what we saw up top. Last area, and for me, we'll know that, when we look at the diagram in Porter's five forces, generally competitive rivalry is in the middle, isn't it? We've got the four forces, a bit like the diamond on the outside. So really, competitive rivalry stands on its own 2 feet, but it's also driven by the other areas. Now, clearly this is high. The profitability and growth in this industry is attracting competition. Seems to be easy to access, low barriers to entry, and indeed it's being impacted upon by tech, which gives new players an edge because things are changing. In terms of decreasing the force, the established players, and I'm talking really specifically of the four big boys, the four market leaders. That may scare off some companies, but it may not. I thought I'd mention it. So, on balance, when we think about each of the forces, and indeed we think about them as a combo, do we see this market as an attractive, profitable market, an attractive, profitable industry? Certainly we do. On balance, Porter's Five Forces tells us that this is an area, this is an industry, this is a market that we would want to be involved with. Let's say if we're considering entering. Let's say we're an existing player like Rodnim. Would we stay in it? I think we would. There's so many things going on. Things could get better, but you need to be on your game. Let's move to the next area, the diamond. Now, this is important for the reasons that I've already stated, i.e., it has been examined several times. What is Porter saying with this diamond? He's simply talking about reasons for the growth of a particular industry. Think of the German car industry. Now think of the impact, let's say, of the First World War on the German car industry. Why is it that Germany has 4 or 5 premium brands and neighboring countries have none? Things came together. Determinants, reasons, factors. So the bottom line in this assessment and application of Porter's diamond to this particular piece seen for Rodnim is to answer the question, you know, is it that there were a number of factors that came together, and where do they fit in across the 4 key elements of the diamond? So let's start with demand conditions. Let me go back a little bit, my apologies. First and foremost is an obvious point, the sophistication of clients. Clearly, the sophistication of clients, in particular the corporates and to a lesser extent the 2 others within this industry, has driven the industry absolutely categorically. And note that, Rodnim is a new player. This industry existed for many, many years before Rodnim came on case. In effect, the partners worked for another events management company. So these clients over the years, 10, 20, 30, 40, they want high quality events. They demand it, and that drives quality and innovation. It drives success. So certainly this factor is relevant. And indeed, over and above that, I mean, obviously, we do need some volume. We need a volume of demand, but the key thing under demand conditions is what companies, businesses learn from their consumers, like German car manufacturers learned from the 1920s, 30s, and indeed onwards. This entity exists in an environment, Holland, that is very well developed. We're told that, it's affluent. We've got savvy consumers, particularly corporates, wanting high core, high caliber events. The next area for us is factor conditions. Easy enough, we're talking about really broadly speaking endowments of production or areas linked into production, if you will. So we split between naturally occurring versus man-made. Now when we think about Harland in terms of what's naturally occurring, it's simple enough. We have a large population, we've got a thriving business community, we've got a large country. That drives the success of many industries and markets. Outside of that, what about man-made factors? Are they relevant? Well, certainly the affluence of consumers, particularly the corporates, and areas such as the media, covering events, social aspects, etc., lifestyle, and obviously the development of IT infrastructures, internet, etc. Think of live streaming as an example. So again, this box is ticked because yes, factor conditions have been relevant to the development of this particular industry, absolutely. The next area for us, related and supporting industries. Now, I've just picked out a few, there'll be others, but certainly entertainment's important. Also, the trend, it's not so much an industry as such, but certainly the trend in urbanization will be relevant too, along with, clearly, in particularly recently, the developments in information technology and indeed information systems. In terms of the corporates, they'll range from a variety of different industries, but without those corporates willing to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars, pounds on events, you don't have an industry. So certainly, again, related and supporting industries, this box is ticked. There are many industries that have helped drive the success. Entertainment is a good example. Next area for us, probably the trickiest area of Porter's Diamond, generally speaking, to sort of apply because it's got 3 parts: strategy, structure, and rivalry. And indeed, students tend to struggle here. The bottom line, let's break it down. When we think about strategy, these are 2 individuals. the partners who had past experience. They're obviously savvy, entrepreneurial. They understood their customers, key to marketing. They understood the market, and indeed they made the decision. I've included their point number two, aim small, miss small. Just this idea that they probably planned to stay small because they wanted to keep control. They want to be independent. They didn't want to rely on other parties. So that was their strategy from the outset. They're certainly aware of trends. This is a small, flat company, friendly, amicable, and indeed they are savvy in terms of what's going on in this market and indeed how it changes. Remember, only 6 years in play. The rivalry is a gimme. Absolutely, categorically. Rivalry has driven this industry and will continue to, but this may cause a problem for smaller players going forward, as we've mentioned. Now, let's remember that in relation to Porter's Diamond, Porter adds in two areas outside of the diamond. He talks about luck or chance events, and then on top of that, he talks about government intervention or lack of it. So, really, in one sense, there's 6 parts to his diamond. His suggestion is that sometimes just some chance events may impact upon an industry. We can't see anything in the pre-scene that's relevant to that. Outside of that, in terms of intervention or lack of intervention on behalf of governments, again, we're not too sure because there's nothing referenced in the pre-scene. But that would be something that we could throw in to a script, your answer, if we get a sniff of Porter's Diamond. So on balance and in summary, certainly this area is relevant. There have been a number of factors over the years that have come together to drive the success of this industry. Really, all 4 areas of the diamond were sort of ticked. Okay? Next area for us, and indeed I think our last area here, straightforward. Generic strategies. What do we mean by generic strategies? Now again, remember that across the board here in these tools and techniques and their application, let's try and remember the buzzwords. If I was an SBL student, I'd be printing off these mind maps, highlighting key buzzwords, and indeed trying to remember to use them in my script, even if we don't get a specific reference to the actual tool. We can talk about, substitute products. We can talk about buyers, we can talk about switching costs, and we can certainly talk about competitive advantage. And that is what Porter is talking about here. He's talking about ways in which companies achieve and indeed maintain or augment competitive advantage. Now, when we look at this pre-scene, I think it's straightforward. For me, cost leadership and focus are not relevant. Cost leadership is about being the lowest cost producer. We don't see anything in the pre-scene that references this idea of being the lowest cost producer. Note, I didn't say lowest cost price or sales value. I said producer. No reference in the pre-scene, not relevant. Focus, for me, no. Because really, when we look at how Rodnim operate, they're interested in all events. They're not focusing on a particular area or niching into an area of the EM industry. They're dealing with things across the board. For me, clearly, they're a differentiator, as are many of the smaller players and possibly the larger players, the 4. They offer a unique service. That's clear. Look at the revenues. Premium, probably very personable. I would have thought they've got some big personalities in the tendering team. Some of those 34 individual full-time employees. And certainly these customers, these clients, particularly the corporates, keep coming back. I would add to that, certainly the idea is high margin, but certainly over the last while since 2X1, the margins are coming down. So it must be probably, most likely, I'm guessing, a pricing issue. So bottom line for me, when we think of competitive advantage, this business, Rodnim, is a differentiator. Absolutely. So, in terms of closure on this, really what we have is our second part now done. And indeed, we're getting, I hope, more and more informed as this consultant or independent advisor that will be asked to be in this role play exam. I hope you're agreeing. I hope that your studies are going well. Remember, with all of this analysis, our pre-scene sick videos, we're heading towards mock exams. Plan the exams. When? How? Manage your environment. Cut yourself off. Do several exams as a minimum. And if you have the option to, get them marked. Thanks for listening. Please do join me shortly for part 3.